It's my honor to be here with people who I so admire. 3 days ago, I buried my mother, and I didn't know whether my heart would allow me to leave her grave. But I'm here because she would be ashamed of me if I didn't come and speak for her. Gauri was somebody who, every time I wrote something, she would call me with excitement. Arundhati, can I translate? Can I translate? I love you. This was our relationship. And today, Gauri is not here. Tista just out of jail. And we know what has happened with Bilkis Bano. I was just trying to think, what is this trail? You know, what is the message that this government is trying to give us? In the recent weeks when Tista was in jail, I was reading with very careful attention the legal documents that the Citizens for Justice and Peace have accumulated in the study of the Gujarat massacre. It is actually phenomenal work, you know, and I am one of those people who had little hope that in an institution functioning inside a fascist state would really give us justice. And I'm talking the coming of fascism since, you know, the late 90s, which some of us saw and were condemned for seeing, even by liberals. But the reason that the work of Tista and her organization is so fantastic is because someday, honestly someday, this documentation, this volume of documentation, this meticulous kind of documentation should really provide evidence for war crimes, because that is what happened in Gujarat. I mean, we used to live in a country where if there was a railway accident, the railway minister would resign. Today we live in a country where people get electoral advantage from massacres, fresh massacres and old massacres. When the Gujarat massacre happened, when the Gujarat pogrom happened, we know the urgency with which the BJP and Narendra Modi were calling for elections. Why was that so? What was that urgency? When Bilkis saw her whole family murdered, she was gang raped, her daughter was killed by having her head smashed against a stone. The bodies of people who were killed were decapitated, they were hidden, there was collusion with the state machinery, there was collusion with doctors, there was collusion with so much of what ought to be the institutions that protect our democracy. But instead, just on the eve of an election, the rapists, the murderers were released. What is this message? Maybe they'll be put back. But the point is that the people who released them were released on a process, a legal process, which might have been misused, but no one has said anything about it. The central government ought to have approved. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but it hasn't said it didn't. We know the people on the committee, many of them are members of the BJP, and we know that one of them said, it's impossible for these men to have committed those crimes because they were Brahmins, many of them. So what we are witnessing is an attempt for international reasons to erase the legal trail of the Gujarat pogrom, but for internal reasons to claim its political legacy. And this is very dangerous because it is being done for the people. So what we are seeing in India today is a fusion between the government, the state enforcement agencies, and a political party. They're all becoming one thing. They're all becoming inseparable from each other. When you have a political party that campaigns for Congress Mukt Bharat, what are they really saying? Given that that is the only national opposition party, they are saying we want an opposition-free democracy. Such a thing does not exist. You cannot have an opposition-free democracy. So it's very clear, the signaling of where we are heading, even while those of us who claim to be, many people who claim to be on the left, many people who are liberals have spent years discussing whether they are fascist or not. Whereas their ideologues are pretty clear about it. Their ideologues are pretty clear about what they want. So are we a democracy? I mean, the BJP has shown in the last 2 elections that it can win elections without the Muslim vote, which means, in effect, 200 million people have been disenfranchised, which means, and we see this every day, not just in the case of Bilkis Bano, but everywhere, that we have a constitution, we have some laws, but those laws, it depends on your caste, your religion, your gender. The laws will be applied depending on who you are. I mean, this has been the case for a long time, but now it's very, very clear. So how can a country that has disenfranchised 200 million people, that is working actively at wrecking the very system of government? We have elections, but the election machinery is wrecked. We have a party which is perhaps the richest political party in the world. That wealth came from demonetization, from opaque electoral bonds. And now the richest party in the world can topple governments, can buy members of parliament, members of the legislative assembly. So I have a suggestion for a new people's movement only for our elected representatives. They should campaign like the Kisan Andolan for a MSP for MLAs and MPs, a minimum support price. And perhaps they can, instead of going to these resorts and all, perhaps they can be stored in an Adani godown. And then they can auction themselves and they can demand at least a minimum rate, you know. Because how is it possible that we live in a country where people go out and vote for a person that represents a particular party, and day after tomorrow that person doesn't represent that party, and that's legal? I mean, what kind of a system is this? You know, how is what is going on in this country counted as democracy? It's not a democracy anymore. And of course it will take our liberals and our very sectarian intellectuals like 20 years more. Now they've just about managed to acknowledge we are fascism. It will take another 20 years to acknowledge that this isn't a democracy. I was scared of coming because, you know, my mind is full of heartbreak and full of grief for Gauri as well as for my mother. When I visited her grave this morning, I saw her mother at the grave and I thought, you know, Gauri, is this Gauri's grave or my mother's grave? But when I saw Gauri's mother at her grave, I thought, imagine what it would be like for my mother to be at my grave. And my mind was just, so in a whirl. I was worried whether I would even say anything that makes sense today. But I just want to end by saying that look at what has happened to us as people who think of ourselves as those in the resistance movement. I used to say, Deepu was talking about surveillance. I used to say that in the late 80s and early 90s, हमारे यहाँ तो दो ताला खोला था, एक मस्जिद का, बाबरी मस्जिद का और एक बाजार का. Like they opened the locks of the market and of the Babri Masjid together. And when they opened those two locks, they unleashed two kinds of totalitarianism, two kinds of fundamentalism. One was religious Hindu fundamentalism and the other was economic fundamentalism. And those two fundamentalisms led to two different reasons for the government to become increasingly a security state. Whether it was Islamic terrorism or whether it was anti-development, quote unquote, terrorism, Maoist protests, all of it. Everything was an excuse for the state to securitize itself. And today we are in a situation, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is it that has brought us to a situation where people who are oppressed, people who have no employment, people who are suffering deeply, are voting for further hellishness upon themselves? What has brought people to believe the reality of propaganda more than the reality that they experience every day in their own homes, in their own kitchens? What is it that makes people who have been oppressed by a caste system for centuries vote for those very people who uphold that system? After all, we know that, today Muslims are disenfranchised, but we come from a society that has dehumanized millions of people by calling them untouchables. And what is it about our imagination that is strengthening that very system now? This is a very, very serious question that we have to ask ourselves. Where did we go wrong? Because if you look at, today this year is the 75th year of India's independence. In Delhi, the city was thick with flags. The saddest thing was that the poorest people, the beggars on the street, the homeless, the starving and the hungry were selling flags. And so the densest population of flags was where the people were the poorest. It was very ironical to just see as a vision, And then I think that, in the 50s, in the 60s, and the 70s, the revolutionary movements in our country, we were asking for revolution. They were asking for the redistribution of wealth, for the redistribution of land, for land to the tiller. Those movements were crushed. By the 90s, we came to anti-displacement. Whatever little we have, don't displace us. Don't take away whatever little we have. Those were crushed. By the 2000s, the radical demand was Manrega. Minimum wages for a few days. For a family, enough, just about what a middle-class person might spend on a meal in a restaurant for the year, for the whole year. That was considered too radical. Now it's not even that. Now it's, हम आपको 5 किलो आटा और नमक और चीनी देंगे, फिर हम कहेंगे कि मोदी जी का नमक खाया तो आप हमें वोट दो. Now that has been withdrawn, and now we are fighting, people are fighting for their very citizenship. 2 million in Assam, literally on the verge of being stripped of citizenship. An occupation, a situation where so much of India is just a police state. I'm not even speaking of Kashmir. How can you suddenly shut down on a whim 7 million people and say you have no means of communication, no connection to the outside world for months together? Can you even imagine it? We can't leave our phones for 15 minutes. That was a war crime. So we are like a plane flying backwards. And today the truth is that we know, and people know, that whoever they vote for, they cannot be sure, even if the BJP loses, that it will not buy over the politicians that have been elected, because it has a lot of money to spend. So we are back where we were under colonialism, when there were no institutions. We have to fight on the street, and we have to start not even on the street, but below the street, because the street has now been poisoned. The street has now had its 24 hours a day toxic intravenous drip from not just the news channels, but every kind of signaling from television series, from films, and even Bollywood is being attacked and shut down because it's too cosmopolitan. So we have to start from sub-zero now, but that is a form of liberation, because we have to now not think of ourselves as defeated, but think of every small victory as a victory and move from there, because the system is broken and I do not think we can fix it. It will break and a new one will be born in its place. But this tyranny will end. It has to end. That is the law of physics. It will end. So let's not lose hope. Inqilab Zindabad.